Hello, everyone. Today we have the parallel session 4, the Water, Energy, Food UBI team. And it's my honor to introduce as speaker today, Michael Jacobson. He's professor of forest research at the UPenn, USA. He's also member and coordinator of the Water, Energy, Food Nexus, and he will give us the talk about water, energy, food, and UBI. Welcome and thank you for your participation. And the next speaker, Guillermo Delgado. He has a PhD at the architecture and planning. He's researcher and coordinator at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. Welcome to you and thank you for your participation. So please, Michael, go forward.
Okay, thanks, Tobias. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone, and good to have you with us today to discuss the linkages between Water, Energy, Food Nexus and UBI, and I'll try and do that. I'm at Penn State in the US, professor of forest resources, and what I'll do is I'll briefly describe the nexus and what it is, and then I'll get into some linkages with UBI that I think of and ways to try and operationalize the nexus. And we have created this Water, Energy, Food Nexus initiative, and we have a website and we have a working group and we have a lot of members, and I'll discuss this briefly at the end. It's basically a collaborative platform, a clearinghouse of information about the nexus in Africa, and that's the website. So just briefly, some thinking about linking UBI and WEF Nexus. So UBI is a social development program. You know, technically they should address ecological issues as much as economic and social issues and give the beneficiaries options. And UBI should also encourage the development of sustainable communities. So questions we can think about is, you know, we often think about labor and capital impacts from UBI, but land is also a factor of reduction of asset. So how does that get influenced by UBI programs? And, you know, thinking about a lot of the ecological negative externalities like climate change, land grabs, deforestation, biodiversity loss, you know, how can UBI help prevent some of these externalities? And then there's also talk about carbon taxes and perhaps other green taxes that can help fund UBI programs, okay? So that's another way to think about it. And so what we're really after is, can better decisions be made by UBI beneficiaries that impact water, energy, food security? So we have a program between Penn State and Freiburg, which is much bigger than this project we're working on. But one of the things we're doing, and that's why Guillermo is going to speak after me, is develop case studies in Namibia where UBI has or is being implemented, and we can look at some WEF Nexus activities related to that. So just a quick definition about WEF Nexus. You can see this diagram here showing the linkages of the three main sectors, and these sectors are all very important for almost any type of project. You need energy, especially for agriculture, you need food production and water for these resource uses. And they embed it in a governance system and social, cultural, economy type situations. There's different scales, you can look at it, and there are different drivers here. So what we want are solutions to the interaction between these sectors. So it's really, and it's not, it's a simple definition to look at the connection between these sectors, but it's really difficult to operationalize them. If you think about the trade-offs and how you can quantify them, it might be easy to quantify them in 2 dimensions or 2 sectors, but when you intersect the third sector, it can get difficult. But we're interested in these synergies, conflicts, and trade-offs across these systems. It also links biophysical and socioeconomic factors, which is important. And it's really about helping decision makers make clearer decisions about these trade-offs. So it's really about, we call it nexus thinking. It provides this conceptual framework where you look across sectors. Another driver of using the nexus approach are the Sustainable Development Goals, especially 2, 6, and 7, which deal with food, water, and energy. And one of the issues with meeting these goals is the decisions, as I mentioned, are made often in silos, different ministries, and they're not really thinking about the interdependence among these sectors. There's a lack of integrative modeling. It's not easy to integrate these sectors. And then if we could, the question is, do we get reliable data for these modeling? And then finally, we all know, those of us who work on research, the policy engagement and the practice is sometimes disconnected. So those are gaps we want to try and address in operationalizing WEF Nexus. So just some examples of the trade-offs, right? If you could look at irrigation, really important in agricultural production. But, you know, what is the type of power or electricity or energy used to pump the water? And, you know, you can see the solar power here. Maybe it's a trade-off from other types of energy uses. And if we do have solar power, like you can see in the middle here, maybe there's going to be excessive use of water because they don't have to pay for it. Obviously, the solar power is just a capital investment, and once it's up and running, the maintenance costs are very low. So you can overuse water in that case, which is one of the issues with this solar powered irrigation systems. And then looking at the costs and benefits of these different irrigation methods to grow the food, and again from that energy connection. We can also look at hydropower. Obviously, it's to produce electricity, but it has trade-offs with respect to ecological impacts on the river and also downstream impacts on irrigation or upstream impacts on irrigation. And so how would hydropower change the water systems? You can also look at renewable energy sources. You know, obviously citing these things like wind power obviously has trade-offs with other land uses. And, you know, what about domestic versus productive uses of biomass energy sources? So, you know, where's the energy coming from? And then finally, charcoal, very important in Africa, or biomass fuels for cooking. How do they impact the other agricultural production inputs and outputs? We can also look at examples of using the nexus for land use and water management. Food security, you need watershed planning. In South Africa, for example, you know, which is a very water scarce country, what's the optimal allocation for water, energy, and agriculture? Often we think about water at its place, but there's also the virtual water, the export of water, which I won't get into, but it's often ignored in these decisions. And then finally, in some countries, like in Ethiopia, in this river basin, there's actually flooding. There's just too much water. And so how do we manage, you know, not only the drought situations like in South Africa, but the flooding situations for food and energy production? There's also a policy governance dimension to the nexus. And you obviously, in terms of transboundary water areas, land use issues obviously impact what small farmers can do with their properties and their land. And then obviously there's policy subsidies which might impact one sector over another. So those are all things that can be examined from a nexus perspective. And I'll just give one more example. Obviously climate change is huge. So we've got changing rainfall patterns. How does that impact WEF systems? I mentioned the drought, and especially if there's the need for hydropower or irrigation, and then just general resource scarcity. So these are all examples. We've done a literature review where we've seen nexus being used in these situations. I just wanted to show you this publication graph of the growth of people thinking about nexus. There was the World Economic Forum that really talked about it in around 2008, 2009. There was a Bonn Nexus conference in 2011. And then it really took off. There was a lot of green thinking and, thinking about bottom-up approaches and modeling. What's interesting though, and a colleague did this in South Africa, made this graph, but you can see that there's a lot more papers that use water, energy, and food and nexus. But when you bring in the word security, there's less, and I'm not quite sure why that is. So as I mentioned at the beginning, our initiative is focused on Africa. You can see Africa is a very big place, and it has a lot of heterogeneity, but the population is going to explode compared to other regions of the world. And almost 2/3 of the population are very young. So, how are we going to provide jobs for most of these people? And we also have to think about the food systems and food insecurity, which is pretty severe, especially post-COVID. And then millions of people are affected by water stress. And there's a lot of population that don't have access to reliable power. In fact, most of them still use wood or charcoal for cooking and don't have electricity like we do in developed countries. So let me just talk about some ways we're thinking about case studies or demonstrations, and this could be applied to Namibia, for example. So it needs to be stakeholder driven. It needs to be bottom up with the beneficiaries, the farmers in mind. And one of the ways to think about it might be, these communities or farmers need technology adoption, like these irrigation systems or solar power irrigation. And so we can look at the trade-offs from introducing such a system. Or if there's a land grab in such a system where some outsider is growing some crop like sugarcane, what's the impact on the water, energy, food systems in those communities? So we would characterize the systems in these selected communities and apply appropriate nexus framework to help these companies who are investing in these areas or government policymakers to really help the small scale farmers who are impacted by these interventions. So we can ask, based on these interventions, how it's altered access and availability to local communities of these common pool resources, these public goods in many ways, like water and energy. And then have these interventions created pathways for better security? And then has household income increases, and is there better resilience and capacity to change? As we know, climate change is one of the main issues. And so if we look at it in that context, we have another dimension to consider. So one of the I'm thinking of ways we can link UBI with Nexus. And one of these papers I found talks about demand assisted agricultural growth strategy. So for example, we have a social protection intervention like a UBI. It has social protection benefits, but it could also have agricultural development benefits. So it's demand driven by the local community to assist with the agricultural growth in that community, leading to transformation of the livelihoods, the combination of these. The example they give in that paper is homegrown school feeding programs, which is a good example of demand-based strategy where you have public procurement of the feeding programs, like a UBI to access food resources. It's locally driven. So it's a structured demand approach that stimulates local economic activity. So there's local production of these food products for the school feeding program. So it helps the local farmers to increase their production, and it has both indirect and direct benefits for the community and others. So the UBI can help stimulate local economic activity through helping farmers produce these goods. And one of the things that made me think about this was during the supply chain shocks of COVID, where people were more reliant in rural areas on local food than getting it imported from the capital or even other countries. So that's an example where we can see a UBI, and we can look at this context in a WEF Nexus framework. Another paper in Southern Africa that I was involved with, just to give you some ideas of how we think about this approach. Obviously, we want water, energy, food security. We want sustainable adaptation to these shocks, and we want creation of jobs and livelihood. So the drivers, and these are the drivers what we're after, but we have barriers, right? I mentioned the silo issues, the uncertainty, the resistance to change, inequality. We have scale issues we have to address. I won't get into those. We can talk about them. And then we talk about tools which we can use to address this, these modeling approaches. And then we look at methods based on these analytical tools to make decisions about these scenarios that we're interested in, which all leads to the outcomes that we want to see, right? But the question is, how do we implement this? So, well, operationalize it is another way to say it. It's nice to have this framework, but how do we operationalize it on the ground? So one approach we use in this paper, and some other colleagues have also looked at it, is agent-based modeling, which is really stakeholder-driven, as I talked about, where we have these expert groups come up with decisions based on their understanding of these sectors. And we find data, which is an important issue at different scales, and we see whether it's available. And then we synthesize this data based on expert stakeholder opinion, even down to the farmer level, and integrate it quantitatively and qualitatively to develop kind of index of different factors affecting the water, energy, food nexus. And then we can look at the trade-offs, for example, in the spider graph situation, where you can see which ones are important and which ones are less important, so it can help decision makers make more clearer decisions about the trade-offs across these sectors. Some other colleagues have been working on a WEF-Tools approach, and you can go to the WEF Nexus index. It was also part of a simpl Nexus, which was an EU project, and you can visit that. And basically, it's the same kind of thing, where you conceptualize the issues, you identify through stakeholders and local experts, you identify and collect data of the situation, you apply a system dynamics model, in this case, a bit different to the agent-based modeling I was mentioning before. And then you can create this composite index, which you can find out more about at this website. And this was done on the Songwe River Basin in Southern Africa. And simpl Nexus has done it in other places as well. So let me finally talk about our initiative in Africa, as I mentioned earlier. What we're trying to do, and this is a proposal we've submitted to NSF to kind of create this network of networks. And so this is us here with our collaborative platform, and we're working with other colleagues like at Michigan State and Sustainable Stockholm Institute, the Stockholm Environmental Institute. And then we have networks throughout the 4 regions of Africa. And then we have, which are local specific on the ground. And then we have Africa-wide networks. Okay, so that's a collaborative learning school is knowledge building, policy, and capacity development are the elements to try and build this network of networks. And we've also, in addition to our Freiburg Penn State collaboration, we also have a Belmont Forum project looking at disaster resilience in the context of Nexus. We have some projects related to catastrophes, so disaster resilience as well. And then I've mentioned a few things we're working with South Africa, trying to operationalize the Nexus. Those are examples of projects we actually engaged in. But just to show you a few things on the website, we've got information about the community. We have over 300 members, so please sign up and join. We have a monthly newsletter. We have webinars. We have a webinar next week. We talk about our project activities. And we mentioned upcoming events. We talk about other events related to Nexus, not only in Africa, but it is focused on Africa. We try to develop things for news. And then finally, we also want to create this collaborative platform so people can create discussion threads. And so that's one of the things we're working on right now. And it's linked to that sustainable food proposal I talked about to build these communities of practice. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll turn it back to Tobias and look forward to some questions, comments.
Yeah, from YouTube, we have no questions, but I think Tobias Domschat will ask something.
Michael, thank you for this great talk. I have a question. What do you think are the factors which motivate the people, e.g. in Africa, to build up a sustainable agricultural system? So you call it the drivers of change, but those people are not cut off from the development of the modern world. So why should they invest in the agricultural development?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, why? Well, first of all, agriculture is the driver of development in many of these countries. I mean, unlike the Green Revolution, which really was positive in Asia and Latin America, Africa was kind of left out. So still the majority of the population rely on agriculture. The question is, how do we take the agricultural production and transform the economy through it? So people don't have to, as you say, live on the land in these modern times. I mean, in our countries, only a few percent of the population are farmers, and there it's over 60%. So the idea is to use the agriculture, which is still the backbone of the GDP and all the economy, but intensify it or increase its productivity so that they can be transformed to perhaps higher and better uses of their expertise and labor. So maybe shifting into manufacturing and industrial, as the model was done in other countries. There's a lot of technologies, digitalization, trade that can all help with this transformation process. So, it's important to realize they can't just get off agriculture and look for other sources of income, although many of them are trying. We need to build a more solid agricultural base that is more intensive in its yields and production, at the same time not quote destroying the environment. So there's a lot of issues, but you can see the constraints in Africa. It's not it's pretty critical, especially in the face of climate change. So people talk about tipping points, and so we really need to work towards more resilient and transformative agricultural systems.
And maybe one more question. What do you think of the interventions of the Chinese government? I mean, they do a lot of investments in Africa, for example. And maybe a second question, can we, maybe from a world perspective, can we afford another industrialization in Africa from a sustainable perspective?
Okay, China and industrialization. Yeah, I mean, so what's the alternative to industrialization in Africa, right? I mean, that's what I'd like to hear. I think, agricultural processing. I mean, there's millions of people to feed, and they're all very subsistence type farmers. Can they get engaged in the market more to increase the agricultural production? And so the industrialization could be from an agricultural processing perspective to feed the rest of the world. And maybe they won't have to go into other kinds of industries, more traditional manufacturing systems, non-agricultural. But, I think that, those areas still need to be happening. And so I don't know how we can avoid industrialization to some degree, and what type is another story. As for China, yeah, they obviously one of the major powers right now, and they are very active in Africa. They've invested a lot, especially in large infrastructure like ports, railroads, and they also do a lot of what we call land acquisition or land grabs, where they are, as I mentioned, moving into communities and creating large-scale plantations for their own food production and exporting it back to China. And obviously this has impacts on the local systems and the community's food production and energy and water, which is one of the things we want to look at. But yeah, so the question is, how could their interventions, I mean, it's not only them, the Europeans are there as well doing some land grabs. And so how can we do it more sustainably, I guess, is the answer. And this is where the governance and the government need to step up and be more responsible about their relationships with these entities.
But you see the solution rather in a bottom-up approach, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at some of the African governments' incapacity to deal, or the enabling environment to deal with these, we really need these bottom-up farmer-led approaches to deal with these, or people who can address them and help make better decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a great discussion. And now, Guillermo, please move forward.
Yes. I'm going to share my screen. Hope you can see it. My name is Guillermo Delgado, and I'm an adjunct researcher at the Department of Land and Property Sciences, and also the coordinator of the Integrated Land Management Institute, both at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. In short, what we try to do at the Institute is to bring together the social-spatial expertise that lies at the university, most of the disciplines related to spatial production are here, like land administration, engineering, architecture, urban planning, and we do not collaborate as much as we should. And I think that's the background for engaging in this, for the institutes to be created. I'm going to speak about a project that I didn't implement through the university, but I did it in partnership with colleagues in the civil society sector. And it is regarding the evaluation of the Namibia's basic income grant pilot in the context of social protection debates and what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this was a report that we did for a project called the Big NAM project from OSISA and the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute in South Africa with my colleagues Dandago and Uhuru. And the report is online. So if you would like to look at it, I can also share the link for you in the chat. I will start with a short introduction to Namibia. And then I will move on to the discussion. And Namibia is, in Southern Africa, but more than geographical, I think what needs to stand out is that it tops the list together with South Africa in the countries that remain with the highest inequality measured by Gini coefficient. It is also one of the most desertic countries south of the Sahara. And coincidentally is also one of the, related to this, also one of the least densely populated countries in the planet. It's a country that did not industrialize. It remained sort of with a very specific role that has its origins in the sort of the colonial system, the plans that it had for that particular territory. And it attained independence in 1990. So you can, from South Africa in that case, that was having a sort of colonial approach to its mandate over Namibia. So it's a relatively new or recent country from that point of view. The diagram here just simply illustrates the different legal frameworks that govern of land governance in the, general governance, but specifically, I think it's important to point out the land governance systems in the region, and also the fact that there was not really sort of any socialist policy experimentation in the territory. So it kind of, whatever was established during the colonial times, it kind of just continued after independence in 1990, if not expanded or consolidated. I'm going to speak just a little bit more about inequality because it's stark, and that I think without that context, one would be at a loss when discussing issues of social protection, industrialization, or for that matter, agriculture, who in one of the most driest countries in the planet, I think, and with very, let me put it this way, specific soil conditions in its territory, one needs to nuance quite a bit what does one speak when one speaks about agriculture. Agriculture remains the largest employer by sector in the country, but those are farmlands, large cattle farms, and also the very populated northern territories who remain largely agricultural. But it is one can say it's almost a negligible contribution to the national economy by sector. So today, still, most of the people that live in Namibia find themselves in one of the 57 urban areas. At independence, this was probably around 30%. So, and around independence also, there were virtually no informal settlements because the colonial/apartheid system had almost a very kind of ruthless control of the territory. So that's important to say that today, most of the people that find themselves in an urban area find themselves in an informal settlement. That is just to say that in the last 30 years, the country has seen significant and profound transformations in its configuration and in the territory. The graph here simply illustrates, it's in Namibian dollars, but it's less the currency that I would like to point out at you. But it's from the Namibia Household Income and Expenditure Survey that was one of 2009. There's more recent data, but it was not captured in the way that it's shown here, where the income is spread out in deciles. And you could see that that fraction of the population who can be considered high and ultra high income in Namibia, it's about 4%. Now, high income in any other context would mean something else, that you are probably wealthy. But you could, in the context of Namibia, it simply means that you can have access to a mortgage, and the mortgage to the house of an average national price. So that's actually just to present you a portrait that the inequality is profound. And also from those who are considered to be employed, about 2/3 find themselves in the informal sector, and those are official figures from the Namibia Statistics Agency. So those are just a little bit of an introduction to get us into the topic that I'd like to speak to you a little bit, which is social protection and the basic income grant process in Namibia and what happened during COVID-19. Social protection system in Namibia is, according to some reports, one of the most comprehensive in the continent. Here I show some of the social protection schemes in the country, and irrespective of the amounts and the specifics of it. What is worth noting is that it is almost universal. So from birth to from becoming an adult, there are mechanisms that one household can access for those in that age. And then comes the old age pension, who starts when one reaches the age of 60. So it is really the kind of, the gap is frankly in those that conventionally one would call are in the working age. And that is the gap that, for instance, could be covered by eventual basic income grant. So another thing that happened in Namibia during the COVID-19 crisis was the implementation of an emergency income grant. This will acquire more sense once I briefly explained for those who are not familiar what has happened in the basic income grant process here. But just to say that it was a once-off cash transfer of about 43 euros that was implemented in an incredibly efficient way. You could say almost unprecedented for state programs. And this sort of it shows evidence of lessons being learned from the basic income grant pilot and campaign, and it is actually, it earned Namibia somehow a somewhat reputation of having done something in a very kind of efficient and socially oriented ways. Before I go here, this is just an image of one of the largest federations of people that live in informal settlements in Namibia, the Shackbullers Federation, that organize around savings groups for improving living conditions here in Namibia. And it is, I have to say, one of the good practices in bottom-up upgrading. Here, it's a learning exchange about urban agriculture, gardens that have been established by members themselves, and circulating members from different urban areas to come and learn about what has been done successfully. And this is, well, on one side, to present to you a sort of snapshot of everyday life in one informal settlement here in Windhoek, but also how there are active bottom-up processes taking place that in the case of, for example, the emergency income grant, intersect with those state-driven efforts. So when we, in this presentation for the report, we speak about the basic income grant as a periodic cash payment, but that is unconditionally delivered to individuals without means test or work requirement. That's generally the concept, and the unconditional is underlined because that's still a bone of contention. In the case of Namibia, as I said when presenting the brackets of social protection, what would make sense is, yeah, well, indeed universal, but to be mindful that the gap of social protection could be covered with this, and based on the lessons of the emergency income grant that used a very efficient system of the database of the fiscus to identify who is a taxpayer in Namibia, which is above a certain threshold, to identify the beneficiaries, can be done in a fairly easy way here in Namibia. So in a nutshell, it was in the 2000s that a coalition around the idea of a basic income grant in Namibia started to form. And it was a campaign. And at some stage, the campaign decided that they needed to prove that this was a good idea by implementing a pilot, which happened in the late 2000s. The theory was, let the evidence speak. And once the evidence is there, let the state act accordingly. So the pilot was implemented in Oshivero, a town, and there was systematic data collected, and all the reports are available online. And surprisingly, or not, during the post-pilot years, the government did not seem to favor the implementation of a basic income grant. And after a series of disappointments, then just recently, last year, grassroots-led basic income grant campaign reconfigured and is now pushing for the state to basically implement a basic income grant. Just also recently, it was also announced that the government will implement a basic income grant, but it is it's not as the definition that I showed earlier, but it's in fact it's in essence a grant that is going to be funded by substituting as a previous government program of a food bank. So it's going to be very targeted and far from what the idea of a universal basic income grant was. So what we did in the report was to engage civil society, government, and development organizations with the basic question of what has happened since the implementation of the pilot and the formation of the coalition, and whether the emergency income grant that was implementing during COVID-19 signaled some change. We also gathered documents and did some a media review. And what I will present very briefly is the key points that are shared, the points where these groups differ. And I think that presents to you a little bit of an idea of where is the process in Namibia at the moment today. Firstly, it is only civil society that understands a basic income grant as universal. Development organizations and government understand it as targeted, something that will only be directed at a certain group. Civil society sees it as a matter of government prioritization of the poorest, which, as we saw in Namibia, are the vast majority. However, development organizations see it more as an issue of affordability. Can it be afforded? Can it be a bankroll or not? Civil society sees a lot very strongly as a demand to redistribute the wealth of the country directly to the poor, whereas government has very clearly made sure that they believe in a sort of trickle-down effect of the economy through employment creation and industrialization and other kinds of measures. Civil society believes, or some sectors of civil society believe in social pressure as a primary tool to advance this agenda, whereas others in civil society, as well as development organization and government, believe more in an engagement approach. And I think that's a sort of characteristic that could eventually be a positive factor for an eventual project that we are currently discussing with the colleagues from Penn State and University of Freiburg. There is an environment of engagement. People hear what each other has to say. So there is potential for fruitful dialogue. Civil society sees a basic income grant as a matter of social justice, whereas others sees it as an administrative matter, how to implement social protection in a more kind of efficient and streamlined way. Civil society sees it as something permanent, whereas others within civil society and the other organizations sees it as a temporary measure, while poverty is eventually kind of eradicated. But of course, that is something that can only be, that it's in the context of, especially post-COVID pandemic, something that will require that it's not in the immediate horizon, let's say. Some see it as a sort of, there's a division between those that see it as expenditure and those that see it as a sort of stimulus of the national economy. But the last 3 points are important because this is where where everybody seems to be on the same page. There's increased acceptance or recognition that direct cash transfers are positive and efficient, instead of creating expensive, sophisticated programs that entail the delivery of services or the delivery of food parcels or other needs. Direct cash transfers seem to gain increased recognition. There is actually also increased recognition that the basic income grant, with the proviso that not everybody perceives or understands the concept in the same way, is a way to address poverty and inequality. And yeah, there's a consensus that every sector would like to address poverty and inequality. But and another important point is that there is, after 30 years of independence, a recognition that poverty and inequality remain persistent measures despite everything that has been tried during the time of independent Namibia. So just the conclusion of this particular report that I came here to talk to you about is that the universality remains a very contentious issue but as I said, the potential is that basic income grant, right, direct cash transfer targeted to a certain sector seems to be or is perceived as generally something positive. There is some kind of dissent in whether social protection is the way to, or the primary or the only way to develop a national economy. So while the current government recognizes the benefit of social protection, they still are not convinced that this is the only way to, or the main way vis-a-vis what the expenditure of a universal basic income grant could represent to the national treasury, that based on official figures, it appears to be, it appears to continue to be depressed in the coming 3 to 4 years. The difference or the discrepancy between expenditure and investment. And even though the basic income grant will not be implemented as perhaps the campaign would like and social justice would like for it to be implemented, it seems to be that the lessons that from the pilot and the campaign appear to inform government's decision. So that is what I came to share with you today. I would like to just take a minute to make a few clarifications that I know that this session has in the title Foreign Aid Financed or Supported Basic Income, which is not yet a sort of discussion here. I mean, of course, the pilot, one could say it was funded by a coalition of churches in Europe. So it is funded through external sources, but this is not yet something that is not yet a conversation that has resonance, especially considering that the main drivers of the basic income grant debate in Namibia remains the basic income grant coalition, which is very anchored in social justice principles, which see this as an opportunity for government to redistribute the wealth of the country and to realize the delayed promises of independence in 1990. So agreeing to basic income grant to be sourced from international aid or other types of funds would be somehow anachronic to or opposite to the message that the coalition has to bring. That in general is what that was just a last disclaimer. And for more information, the Basic Income Grant Coalition has a website and plenty of social media, and all the reports are online. So that's it. So now over to Tobias, and I welcome any other questions. Thank you.
So thank you for this presentation. Sabine Heisner say thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And I say this too, this was a great lecture. There is no other questions. So I would say we go further. So to the next slides. Okay, and one. So welcome everyone. Today I want to a little bit talk about social accounting matrix and foreign aid in Namibia. And that social accounting matrix is an approach to think about this topic. And I would say a little bit about foreign aid. I think Guillermo mentioned it from the Namibia side, and may I say something a little bit. This is work in progress, so there are no finished results. Sorry for that. But so let's go. First, I say a little bit about Namibia, but Guillermo also do that, so we can skip it very fast. And I present a little bit from the German government budget. And then I introduce the idea of foreign aid basic income and talk a little bit about the social accounting matrix and show you my next step. So environment, population, we can skip. We heard a lot and interesting stuff about that. Maybe an important point is that the economy in Namibia is under stress. So we have more or less 5 years with recession. Okay, and that's a problem. No mention if you don't like row or so. That's a complete different thing than a recession. A recession is, they are not positive things. If you talk about a recession, that's only negative. And Guillermo also mentioned the high inequality. And that's another problem because the IMF and the World Bank, they list Namibia as a middle income country, but this is driven by commodities. So the reality, they are much poorer. And that's a problem because it's very difficult to negotiate some agreements as a middle income country. Yeah, then we can move forwards. Now I want to talk a little bit about the government budget, and you can see the blue line, that's the total revenue and grants. And you can see the rise, maybe so, yeah, the rise a lot of years get more and more revenues, and then they stagnate. And this had to do with the recession. The gray line, that's the revenues percent of GDP. And Guillermo mentioned it, that they want to see some of redistribution of wealth. You can see that's not happened, right? That the same tax structure over the years, very the same. It's up and down, but that's only good years, bad years, and so on. But they know change the tax system. And then the black line, this is the total expenses. So and you see that they cross the blue line, and the space between, that's the debt, okay? The balance budget is negative. And I'm not a hawk, so I have no problem with government debt. So, but we have to think that this is mostly in foreign currency. And if you get the debt with foreign currency, you get trouble at any point, sometimes in the future, with the IMF. And then you have a hard time to negotiate social security issues. That's keep in mind if you talk about policy in countries like Namibia or other developing countries. They are not complete sovereign. If they get problems with the balance account, with the balance of payments or with the current account, they lost freedom to do what they want. So keep this in mind. The budget is under stress, so COVID make it a little bit worse. And that's the enter point for the foreign aid basic income. So the first idea is simple. Look, the ODR, that's the official development aid, flows to Namibia, so very constant, right? So between 150 million and 200 millions. And this big increase had to do with the commodity price. This might guess, so I'm not sure, but I think that had to do with the commodity price. And you can see that's a huge money. That's not, I mean, if you think the complete world, then it's not much, right? For US, for Germany, that's not the big money, but for Namibia, it's certain serious money, right? And if you now look in current US dollar, the ODR per capita per month, you will get something like $5. Okay, $5. It's not much, but okay, 70, 50, 75 Namibian dollars. And now you have to see that what we talk about FRIBIS is not payment for other, so we are not interested in complete founding such a chain. We are interested in to start this kind of chain, and then after time, more and more the national tax system get more and more share. So that's the idea. It's only a start, and you can see it's maybe the half, we can say, or yeah, maybe we can start with the half, right? And then the Namibian state give the other part. And that doesn't change much between in the budget, because they also have some payments. We see it by Guillermo. They have some social protection and payments. Another way to think on this issue is in the case of Germany, for example, they agree now in an agreement with Namibia about the Heru Nama genocide, that they won't pay 1.1 billion, and that's over 13 years. That's a little bit, yeah, I mean, 13 years, that's not much, but anyway, if you make a quick calculation, yeah, and we took 15 years, we can say that that's 30 Namibian dollars for every person. And why we should such money sent to the government? Why not to the people? I mean, the people suffer, not so much the government, right? And that's another way how you can think about foreign aid basic income. And then you have to rephrase the wording aid or support to share or reparation, right? That's a complete different story than a different narrative. So I think this agreement is an unused opportunity for FRIBIS. Now I come to the social accounting matrix. And that's an approach that is very famous. So the World Bank and other international institutions use it. But for basic income, they are more or less novel, because yeah, they love the pilots, they make random control trails, but they don't work with social accounting matrix so far. What is in SAM? So I call it SAM now. It's nothing more than double entry bookkeeping, okay? For every account that exists, the rule incoming into one account must be outcoming from another account. That's very simple. We see immediately what it means. And another important point is we have the data from a specific year, the year with the best data, with the most data, and then we make a snapshot, right? A picture, and then we can see what happened in this year in this economy. And that's provide us data for economic modeling, for so-called multi-linear models or multiply models, but also about CGIs, that's micro simulation, and that also to do with the agent-based modeling. So we can use also some of the data for such models. And that's very powerful because they are comprehensive, consistent. And that show us the interrelationship of an economy. And that's really interesting because now we can see the macro level, the micro level, and we can how different sectors work with each other. So let us look at that's a typical structure of a social economic matrix. And think about the commodity and the activity as the social, as the service and the goods sector. Then we have factors that's had to do with the production function. And later we have the enterprise, the government, and the saving. That's the institution. Sorry, the household, the enterprise, and the government. That's other institution. Saving investment is the current account, and the rest of the world is the rest of the world. Okay. So what I mean with this is balanced because here we can see the income of each sector, and this income have to be the same as the expenditure. So if you say, wow, so you can have savings, you have so household incomes increase, for example, and then something you have more money, so you increase saving, but in the end the expenditure is the same. Okay, this is every time the same, and that's what we mean with balance. And now that's from the first structure, the first idea how it works. And now I come to my research questions. Think what multiplier effects occurs with a basic income. So simply what's happened in the economy when basic income, so finite basic income, for example, entered the picture. Okay, in this case, we will see that this row will increase. So the household income will increase, and then household consumption or household saving will also increase. But what's happened if household consumption increase, demand increase, and if that demand increase, something had to increase here, right? Maybe domestic production as an example. The important point is that's what we call multiplier. You give something into this system and then something happens. We don't know exactly what happens, but if we have the data for these flows, we have a coefficient and we can calculate under assumptions what's happened. And this, I think, is novel, really a novel approach in the basic income discussion. So the second point is how shock disrupt the structure or the economic system. Think about COVID. So that's the other, that's the household income decrease, and then on so on and so on. Okay, that's the same story, different direction. But very important is the third, the last point, what environmental and technological effects can occur after the introduction of basic income. And that's had to do with the water, energy, food. You can link such data with the environmental data. So think household consumption increase. We know something also increase, maybe the water demand, maybe, I don't know, something else, right? So we can link this data with the environmental data. There exist studies with do that exact this. And hopefully we come to this point that we can do that. The very important point here is that we get the data. Sorry. And you can also disaggregate this structure. Think you can split household in informal and formal. So for example, informal households, so informal worker and formal workers. And then you get deeper and deeper, you get more and more accurate, more and more information. The only problem is the data. So you limit because you have not enough data. The macro level is more or less easy. You have Ministry of Finance, you have the national accounts, the balance of payment, population. That is more or less easy. I have this data for the Ministry of Finance, for example, the national accounts. That's fine. The problem is the micro level. So the data get worse. The Namibia Household Income Expenditure Survey, they do every, maybe 4 or 5 years, they get a new one. And I think the best year what we can use it is 2016, because we have the labor force and the Namibian Household Income Survey. Problem is the supply use tables that's had to do with the production side. We don't have this, but there exists solution for that. And we can also do a regional SAM that had to do with also get me the data for a specific region in Namibia or not, simply. And then finally, and that's the last step, we have to connect this data with water, energy, food, for example, water consumption, and so on and so on. But then you get really idea what's happened and what be, maybe you have to do both, right? You have to influence the technology and the basic income. Maybe you transfer technology and then you change the behavior from people, and then, okay, so you have a system, both sides get interact with each other. So my next step will be that data pooling. Okay, I look for old SAMs for Namibia and then show what they do and how they calculate that. Then I estimate my own macro SAM. That's a hard step because you need a lot of data, and then disaggregate that. And that's very important. Balance had to do that. That's a technical issue. Okay. And combine data with environmental data. I talk about that. And then I back to my research question, and you can use the data for modeling. And I hope then we get results that are new, right? Or I think that helps also the discussion in Namibia, because then maybe the government realized that tax expenditure, also the income from other people, and with this income they pay something. So redistribution don't mean necessary disinvestment, or I mean that's a supply side argument, but that's not necessarily true. Redistribution can be booster growth, and I think you can show that with that social accounting matrix. So I think I'm finished with my presentation. Now I was a little bit fast, but I think, maybe there's some questions.
As it was your talk and you cannot be the moderator of your own talk, there's no questions from the audience from YouTube, but Sabine says thank you for your presentation too, Tobias. So thank you very much. But is there any question from Michael or Guillermo?
I'll ask a question. Tobias, and also might have one for Guillermo, but Tobias, because it's fresh. I'm just thinking of, the SAM matrix. I guess there are studies that have incorporated these environmental attributes in them. Have you thought about how you would include those?
Yeah, I know that they need some similar system, and then they connect them, for example, the consumption patterns, and they're very important that they don't change it.
We can't hear you. Is there someone in the background there talking?
No, actually.
There's someone talking in your background. No?
Is it you?
Oh, sorry.
There seems to be an echo.
Yeah. Okay, so
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I know they also work with a table like SAM for environmental issues, but I don't know how exactly this works. So I can search this publication. I know them, but I don't read that exactly how it works.
Okay.
And your model, do you foresee already have some hypothesis of what would happen with the implementation of basic income grant in Namibia? I hear some critics here say that prices will rise once there is this capital flowing. But of course, that are arguments that might kind of also, be from that perspective, but that comes from other types of modeling. But yours?
The first step is the data, and then you make a model, and the model needs assumptions. It's very important, because in the assumption you can play around, right? And you can get the results. But think, if the money comes from outside, you have pressure on the exchange. If the money high enough, you get pressure on your currency. I think that can be happened, because if the people consumption high level foreign goods, then the money flows back. Okay, and that's all. That's really interesting stuff. That's macroeconomic stuff, but that's interesting. I don't know exactly what happened, and I don't know how many money that's had to do with the financial market and so on. But they are interesting questions, and that goes in the right direction completely. That's the right questions, I think. But you have also the question, if you don't use the foreign aid, if you only have the tax system and you change the tax structure, you can also get maybe inflation pressure, because the price will rise in the domestic market and so on. So also that's the same. You can do with the same, not only foreign aid, you can also change the tax system. That's no problem. So if you have the data, you can do that. And then you can play around what's happened if this, what happened.
So maybe one more question, maybe a general question to all of you, because you all do research on a foreign country for you. And my question is actually, what do you think, what do the local people say, or what do African researchers say about your research on their topics actually? Are you in touch with those local peoples? I mean, in the pilot, it's obvious, but yeah, what do you aim to achieve with this?
Yeah, just a sort of quick correction. I mean, I am based in Namibia. I live here. So, but and the only project that I've done on the issue of the basic income grant was really very much was a portrait. So it was not, and it was very much in conversation with the colleagues, both in government, civil society, and also international organizations. So I think I circulated the report, and they see themselves reflected on what I wrote. So in my view, actually, this is just a snapshot. It's not, I don't think it is, one can even call it a research. It was actually a sort of report to present a bit of where are we now in the process. But I can say that it's, as I spoke, a little bit polarized. So civil society really seeing basic income grant as a kind of social justice demand, and government see it in a more kind of administrative, kind of technical way, whether it makes sense and the numbers are matching, and whether it sends the right message to emphasize social protection vis-a-vis other kinds of efforts that the state could support, like industrialization, land reform, or other kinds of things that they also see as empowering.
Well, I'll just say, you saw my very first point in these approaches is stakeholder driven, right? So I've worked in many communities in Africa where, you know, the first thing is you visit them and you want to gain their trust, right? And you also want it to, you want the questions to come from them. You want their issues to be raised. It's not like what we want to do. So I've seen, you know, we would come, we would talk about our potential help, you know, I put it bluntly. I mean, we have some knowledge we can impart, I think, but if they're not interested, then yeah, that's the end of it. And we want to find communities that want to work with us.
Yeah, I can
thank
maybe
you.
one short remark. We are in touch with Namibians, and we also get so for example, they don't want a pilot anymore, so they say enough pilots, okay, and so we get information and we get some insights. But I think this is an important point that we have to listen what they say. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think we are then finished, and thank you all participation. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you, Tobias Dumschat, for technical support. And then, ciao.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.